There was a moment, buried somewhere in the wreckage of his first life, when Damian Haxon understood what it meant to be truly powerless. Not the powerlessness of a man outnumbered in a fight, or a young noble outranked by his betters. Something far worse than that. His body had kept moving long after his mind went dark. His hands, his legs, his sword arm, all of it still working, still precise, still lethal, but controlled by something else entirely. He had stood inside his own skull like a prisoner behind thick glass and watched his hands kill his father, watched them kill his sister, watched them tear through every person he had ever loved, one after the next, while he screamed in a silence no one could hear. The Archlich Dorgo had needed a weapon. Damian had made an excellent one. By the time the last of the undead horde fell and the dark magic binding him finally cracked, and it was Damian himself who cracked it, dragging what remained of his will against centuries of necromantic chains, there was nothing left to protect. The mansion was ash. The graves were fresh. He stood in the rain in the ruin of his family's home with blood on his hands that would never come clean, and he made one final decision. He drove the blade inward, and the world went dark. Most men, when they die, simply stop. Damian woke up 17 years old, kneeling in grass behind the Haxon estate, with sunlight on his face and the sound of his sister's voice drifting through an open window above him. He didn't move for a long time. He just listened. Louise was humming something, an old tune she had learned from their mother, and the sound of it broke something open in his chest that he hadn't known was still capable of breaking. He pressed his fist against the ground to keep himself upright. Tears fell from his eyes and landed in the dirt. The mansion was not ash. The graves did not exist, and somewhere inside that house, his family was alive. He had been given something that the world did not give to anyone. He had absolutely no intention of wasting it. This is the story of the Death Knight who returned. To understand what came next, you need to understand what Damian was carrying. In his first life, he had been an embarrassment. The eldest son of Viscount Pauldays Haxon, a minor noble house in a world governed by bloodlines, blade skill, and the brutal arithmetic of social rank, Damian had spent his youth making a mess of every opportunity his family gave him. He picked fights he shouldn't have. He destroyed his sister's engagement through sheer recklessness. He drank, caused scenes at formal banquets, and drove his father to fury so many times that Paul eventually threw him out entirely. That was how the Archlich found him. Alone, disgraced, with no one coming to help. By the time Dorgo was finished with him, Damian had become something the world had no name for, the Death Knight, a figure so feared that entire armies turned and ran at the sight of him. He had spent what felt like centuries in service to the undead, absorbing the fighting techniques of every warrior who came to kill him, collecting their skills into a memory that never faded. He had fought mages, knights, divine paladins, and monsters that should have been myths. He had absorbed dark spells directly through a mark burned into his hand, a thing called the Authority of Greed, given to him by Dorgo, designed to drain power from enemies, which Damian had turned into his own quiet weapon. All of that knowledge had come back with him. His teenage body had not. He stood behind the estate on the morning of his second chance, looked at the arms of a 17-year-old who hadn't trained a day in his life, and understood the problem immediately. The memories were there, every sword form, every counter technique, every dark magic absorption method filed away with perfect clarity. The muscles to execute them were not. His stamina was almost nothing. His mana control was weak. He was a master craftsman, handed a broken tool. He picked up a tree branch from the ground and swung it in a short, controlled arc. The branch struck a boulder at the edge of the garden. The boulder cracked. Then the crack spread. Then the whole rock split apart and the two halves tumbled into the grass, and the sound of it echoed off the estate walls loud enough that a servant came running from the kitchen. Damian looked at the branch in his hand. The technique was called wave breaking, a foundational sword skill he had used so many thousands of times it lived in his bones rather than his head. Even with this body, even with almost no physical conditioning, the method still worked. He dropped the branch and walked back inside. There was a great deal of work to do. The first thing he did was face his family. This sounds simpler than it was. Pauldays Haxon was not a gentle man. He was a viscount who had spent decades building a modest, noble house through discipline and careful management, and his eldest son had spent those same decades dismantling his efforts one scandal at a time. The last time they had spoken before Damian's regression, in this timeline, just days ago from his family's perspective, Damian had drunkenly started a brawl at a local bar and nearly gotten 3 men killed. So when Damian walked into his father's study, stood before the desk where Paul was already pulling out documents related to the legal fallout, and spoke calmly and clearly about what he had done wrong, the silence that followed was significant. Paul stared at his son. Louise, standing in the doorway behind Damian with her hands pressed together, went very still. Damian didn't grovel. He didn't make promises he would perform rather than keep. He simply listed what he had done, acknowledged the consequences, and told his father he intended to correct it. His voice was level, his eyes were calm. The posture of a man who had lived 1,000 years of war looked strange on a 17-year-old's frame, and Paul clearly had no idea what to make of it. Louise watched her brother leave the room afterward and felt something she couldn't quite name. He had looked at her when he walked out. Just a glance, but it was the kind of look that contained something deep and careful, like a man checking that a precious thing was still intact. She didn't know then what that look meant. She would come to understand it later. The bar fight fallout had left a debt with a local syndicate called the Black Snake, a rough organization that ran the underbelly of the district, not powerful enough to be a real threat to noble houses, but sharp enough to make life uncomfortable. Damian's brawl had apparently insulted the wrong people, and the pressure on House Haxon's name was building. He went to the pub himself to sort it. He walked in without a weapon, sat down across from the men waiting for him, and began the process of offering a reasonable settlement. He was entirely prepared to handle this cleanly. The men at the table were not interested in clean. One of them made a comment about Louise. The pub was quiet for a long breath after that. Damian took the nearest man's wrist, applied pressure to one precise point, and listened to the sound of breaking bones without changing his expression. The others moved. He moved faster. By the time the dust settled, 3 men were on the floor, and the apprentice knight the syndicate had hired as their muscle, a man called Ted who used a water technique style that Damian had cataloged and stored decades ago, was lying against the far wall wondering how he had lost a hand-to-hand fight with a nobleman's son who hadn't drawn a weapon. Damian crouched down to Ted's level. He told Ted, politely, that he would be taking a supply of medical potions and a reasonable amount of gold as compensation for the insult to his family. He explained where the syndicate's owner, a man named Cedric, could reach him if he wanted to discuss the matter further. He straightened up, adjusted his collar, and walked out. Victor, the Haxon household's chief servant, a large and dramatic man who had accompanied Damian on this visit despite his better judgment, stood outside with his eyes very wide. He had been a member of the Haxon household for years and had watched young Master Damian embarrass himself in public on approximately 40 separate occasions. He had never once seen him do anything like that. He scrambled to follow Damian down the street and managed to say nothing the entire walk home. Cedric, as it turned out, did not want to discuss the matter. He wanted Damian dead. He sent for a hired mage from a dark magic organization called Yulan, a sect that worked in shadows and traded in exactly the kind of forbidden techniques that made the Holy Church lose sleep. The assassin arrived at the Haxon estate at night, moving silently through the garden, heading for the wing of the house where Louise slept. He never reached her. Damian had been awake. He had spent the hours after midnight training his body in the courtyard, push and pull routines, breathing exercises, the grinding physical work of rebuilding what years of idleness had let decay, and he felt the wrongness in the air before the assassin cleared the garden wall. The chase that followed was brief. The fight at the mage's hideout was not long either. Damian's authority of greed, the mark on his hand, the old gift from Dorgo turned inside out, absorbed the dark spells thrown at him and converted them to nothing. The mage had trained for years in techniques that Damian had faced, analyzed, and filed away in another lifetime. He came back to the estate with the mage's grimoire under one arm and a problem that now had a shape. Cedric had connections to Yulan. That meant this wasn't a common syndicate dispute. It meant dark magic had already found a foothold in the district, and it meant the Holy Church needed to know. There was a paladin stationed nearby, the first apprentice of the Azure Flame Division, a young woman named Agnes who had a reputation for taking dark magic very seriously. Damian left the grimoire and the mage's identifying marks with her directly, explained what Cedric had done, and watched as the gears of the church's enforcement machinery began to turn. Agnes, for her part, looked at this Viscount's son with considerable suspicion. He had arrived unannounced at an odd hour, carrying evidence of a dark magic assassination attempt, and presented it with the calm efficiency of someone who did this professionally. She had no framework for what he was. She filed it away and went to work. Cedric's operation was exposed publicly within days. The Black Snake Syndicate collapsed under church scrutiny. Cedric himself was arrested, and the quiet pressure that had been building against House Haxon dissolved. It was a clean resolution. Damian moved on to the next problem. The next problem arrived in formal attire. Erwin Lion Bloom was the son of a powerful noble family. House Lion Bloom outranked House Haxon in almost every measurable way, and Erwin had spent years treating that gap as permission to do whatever he liked. In Damian's first life, Erwin had eventually gotten exactly what he wanted. Louise, sold into a marriage she never agreed to, and treated afterward in ways that Damian did not permit himself to think about in too much detail. In this life, Erwin arrived at the Haxon estate to leverage an incident from the same bar brawl, some minor insult that his family's lawyers had inflated into a formal grievance, and to use that leverage to demand Louise's hand in marriage. Paul was in a difficult position. House Lion Bloom's political weight was real, and the Haxon family's name was still recovering. He sat at the formal meeting table with his hands flat on the surface and said nothing while Erwin's representative laid out the proposal. Damian sat across from Erwin and looked at him with an expression of perfect patience. Erwin was not accustomed to being looked at that way by someone he outranked. He decided that the solution was to invoke his right to a formal duel, a settlement method that still carried legal weight in noble disputes. He nominated one of his official knights as his champion. Damian accepted. He requested the use of a dinner fork. The silence in the room at that point was different in quality from ordinary silences. The duel took place in the Haxon courtyard 2 mornings later, with Erwin's full contingent of guards watching from the gate. The official knight he had sent was a trained aura swordsman, someone who had spent years mastering the technique of channeling internal energy along a blade to multiply cutting force. It was a respected style. Against an ordinary opponent, it would have ended matters quickly. Damian held the fork loosely, tines forward, and waited. The knight attacked. He used his form well. The opening movement was clean, the aura behind it genuine. He was good at his craft. Damian stepped into the attack rather than away from it, redirected the knight's wrist with his free hand, and put the fork handle across the back of the knight's knee with enough precise force to buckle him without breaking anything important. The knight hit the ground. Damian's hand was already moving. He had encountered aura swordsmanship in roughly 100 different configurations across his first life. He had absorbed the core principles of every variation he'd faced, understood the 17 most common forms and the 8 rarest ones, and knew that the particular style this knight used had an inherent gap at the 3rd transition point. He demonstrated that gap twice more before the knight went still. Erwin stared from the gate. Damian walked over to Erwin, still holding the fork, and explained clearly and without raising his voice that the debt was settled, that Louise was not available, and that House Lion Bloom should consider the matter closed. He looked Erwin in the eyes for a moment that Erwin found extremely uncomfortable. Then he turned and walked back to the house. Louise, watching from a second-floor window, pressed her hand flat against the glass. She had watched Erwin be humiliated with a dinner fork in less than 3 minutes. She had no idea who her brother had become, but she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones, that the man who had walked out into that courtyard was not going to let anything happen to her. Later that evening, she came to his room and gave him their father's sword. An old cavalry blade, slightly worn, the kind of thing a family keeps because it means something rather than because it cuts well. She placed it in his hands and said it was a thank you, but her face said it was more than that. Damian held the blade for a while after she left. He ran his thumb across the edge the way their father had always done. Old habit. Cedric's arrest had left one thread unresolved. House Lion Bloom had not quietly accepted their defeat. The official knight Damian had beaten was apparently not message enough, because 2 weeks later, a senior Lion Bloom fighter named Garrick showed up at the Haxon estate gates with a small squad, claiming a rights dispute and requesting entry. Garrick was an official knight, 2 full ranks above a trainee, 1 above an apprentice, a seasoned fighter who had spent years accumulating real combat experience. In this world, the knight ranking ran from trainee through apprentice, up to official, then middle class, then high class, and finally the near-mythical master class, of which only 3 or 4 existed across the entire continent. Garrick was nowhere near the top of that ladder, but against a normal 17-year-old noble, he was more than enough. Agnes happened to be at the estate at the time. She had come to deliver the official documentation of Cedric's arrest, and she was still in the sitting room with Paul when Garrick's squad came through the gate. The timing was either very fortunate or not accidental. Damian had, in fact, sent her a message that morning suggesting she might want to stop by. Garrick's squad was neutralized with efficiency. Damian took Garrick personally, used 3 of the 47 counter-sequences he had memorized for the official night style, and left Garrick sitting in the courtyard with a dislocated shoulder and a great deal to think about. With Agnes present as a representative of the Holy Church, the attack on a noble estate became a matter of official record. House Lion Bloom received the documentation the next morning and went very quiet. Paul watched all of this from his study window and poured himself a drink. He was a viscount who had governed his household with discipline for 20 years, and he was intelligent enough to understand that something fundamental had shifted in his eldest son. He didn't yet know what it was or where it came from. He filed it under things he intended to understand eventually and focused on the immediate benefit. House Haxon's name was no longer bleeding. The next problem was money, specifically a 300 gold debt that House Haxon owed to Duke Adam Gold Pixie, one of the most powerful noble families in the region, the kind of house that could erase a viscountcy from the records if the mood struck. The debt had been hanging over Paul's finances for years, a slow weight that compressed their options at every turn. Damian traveled to Duke Adam's estate to resolve it. The proposal he brought was specific. House Haxon would represent Duke Adam's interests in an upcoming mine rights duel against House Lion Bloom. The disputed mine was valuable enough that the Duke had been looking for a competent champion for months without finding one he trusted. Damian was offering to be that champion. Duke Adam was not impressed by the offer on its face. A teenage viscount's son walking in and promising to win a legal duel on behalf of a duchy was not a serious proposal. He was polite about his skepticism, in the careful way that powerful men are polite when they want you to know they are unimpressed. Damian asked to demonstrate his qualifications. The Duke's household knight, a mid-class fighter named Horwitz, someone who had spent years reaching the middle tier of the continental ranking, was brought in. Horwitz leveled his spear in a short test of force. Damian blocked it bare-handed, not deflected, not redirected, blocked it, absorbed the force, and held the spear in place with 2 fingers, while Horwitz pushed against him with full strength and the tip did not move. Duke Adam watched this with considerable attention. The debt was restructured. Damian received a supply of conditioning pills, an alchemical aid that would accelerate his body's physical development, and the formal title of the Duke's representative. He shook the Duke's hand with the composure of a man who considered this a reasonable outcome and departed. The weeks before the mine duel gave Damian a project. Duke Adam's territory had a small local guard unit, 3 knights, theoretically, who were in practice nearly useless. They trained badly, fought without coordination, and had developed a comfortable belief that nothing serious would ever be asked of them. Damian had heard them called the Three Stooges, a nickname that required no elaboration. Their names were Pable, Lanky, and Fatty. He informed them that their training would now be conducted by him and that they would begin that evening. He used a technique he had learned in his first life from a figure known only as the character corrector, a method called AMSA, or My Kill, which was designed specifically to beat a person into comprehensive physical and mental improvement without leaving a mark on them. The method was precise and very effective, and extremely unpleasant to experience. The Three Stooges experienced it every night for several weeks. By the end of those weeks, they were unrecognizable. They still were not elite knights, but they were knights who moved with intention, who understood how to read an opponent's tell, and who, critically, had been drilled until they knew the Lion Bloom fighting style and its weaknesses well enough to anticipate it. Pable, who was technically the most capable of the 3, had developed the useful ability to recognize the specific setup pattern that Lion Bloom knights used before their signature technique. This would matter. Before the mine duel, a complication arrived. Duke Adam's illegitimate daughter, Chelsea Gold Pixie, returned to the region with a fighter in tow, a large, physically imposing man called Gwome Blackwing, who she was presenting as a potential champion to replace Damian. Chelsea had been disowned by her father years before, and she carried that wound the way some people carry a blade, close to the body and used whenever the opportunity appeared. She had also, Damian noticed almost immediately, made contact with Yulan. The dark magic connection was subtle, not in her behavior, which was arrogant and controlled, but in Guam. Something about Guam's power readings was wrong. The kind of wrong that Damian had spent a lifetime learning to recognize. Chelsea used a dinner gathering to demonstrate Guam's strength, a test of raw force that Guam won against every knight present until Damian stepped in and flipped Guam with one hand, which visibly annoyed everyone in Chelsea's contingent. She adjusted her approach. That night she deployed a dark magic incense in his room, a spellbinding compound designed to cloud judgment and create vulnerability. When Damian walked in and recognized the smell immediately, she was waiting in the corridor with 2 guards and an ultimatum about his family. Damian slit the guards' throats before they finished moving. He looked at Chelsea and told her, very quietly, that she had one opportunity to withdraw, and that this offer would not be repeated. She didn't withdraw. She believed she had more leverage than she did. The formal duel came a few days later. Damian selected his weapon from a collection of resonant steel, a material that created vibration frequencies when struck, and chose a long, tuning fork-shaped blade called the 1,000-League Sword. It looked strange. Chelsea's associates assumed it was an eccentric choice. Against Guam, Damian drove the blade against the man's body and sent vibration through him at the precise frequency that disrupted mana control. The dark magic compounds that Yulan had implanted in Guam to boost his power destabilized and became visible, rising off him like smoke from a wet fire. Every knight present could see it. Chelsea was exposed in front of her father, her political allies, and the Holy Church representatives who happened to be in attendance. Duke Adam, who had spent years controlling his grief over his daughter's path through practiced cold distance, had her arrested. He sat alone in his study that night and drank in silence, and the expression on his face was not one that victory usually produces. Chelsea was eventually found dead in her cell. The official finding was suicide. The unofficial understanding was more complicated. The mind duel happened in stages. House Lionbloom sent a series of champions. Pabel, shaped by weeks of grinding night training into someone who no longer fought like himself but like someone who had studied his enemy, won his match by doing something his opponent had never experienced. He anticipated the setup. Every Lionbloom knight had a tell before their signature technique, a half-second of weight shift that Pabel now recognized as clearly as his own breathing. When the technique came, he wasn't where it was aimed. The Lionbloom representative looked at Pabel afterward with an expression that was difficult to read. He had not expected this. When it came to Damian's match, House Lionbloom sent Michael Lionbloom, one of their strongest fighters, a man with real combat experience and the kind of arrogance that usually means a person has won most of their fights. They faced each other in the duel space. Michael drew his weapon and settled into his stance. Damian looked at him. Something happened to Michael in the seconds that followed. He would struggle to explain it afterward. It was not anything Damian did in a physical sense. No technique, no strike, no movement. It was the quality of the regard, the absolute certainty behind the eyes, a weight of experience so dense it pressed against Michael's instincts like a wall, and his instincts, the part of a fighter that had kept him alive through years of genuine combat, told him clearly what would happen if this began. He saw it. Not the whole fight, but the end of it. Michael lowered his weapon and surrendered. The crowd was silent. The Lionbloom contingent stared. Duke Adam, watching from the elevated observer's position, set down his cup. Damian accepted the surrender with a nod and turned to collect the reward terms. House Haxon received access to significant resources from the mine arrangement. Damian came away with, among other things, a 100-kilogram enchanted storage ring and a custom hunting bow crafted by an artisan named August, a weapon made from minotaur horn that had properties interesting enough that he had specific plans for it. The road home from the Gold Pixie estate was not quiet. It rarely was. A mid-class knight named Ernst had been connected to the Chelsea situation, not as a traitor himself, but as someone whose emotional collapse after her death had left him vulnerable. Yulan found vulnerable people useful. Ernst had been compromised through his grief, and by the time Damian's party was riding home through the narrow forest roads east of the estate, Ernst was leading a Yulan ambush squad that included 2 mages, Rebecca and Mustang. Rebecca and Mustang were not apprentices. They were trained Yulan operatives with years of combat experience. When they peeled off Damian's group and cornered him on a side road, they were confident. They had not encountered the authority of greed before. The mark on Damian's hand absorbed their dark spells as they arrived, not deflecting, not blocking, literally consuming the attacks and converting them to nothing. He let them exhaust 2 complete casting sequences before he responded. His counter involved the 9th circle of dark magic, a technique called pitch darkness, which he had absorbed from a Yulan grimoire weeks earlier. The mages recognized it. 9th circle dark magic was supposed to be accessible only to the most advanced practitioners in the world. Watching a young high-class fighter, at most, in their assessment, deploy it without preparation shook them in a way they didn't have time to process before it was over. Damian extracted their souls afterward. It was a technique from his Death Knight years that he preferred not to use unnecessarily, but the intelligence value of what Yulan operatives knew was too significant to leave behind. Ernst was a different problem. Ernst had been controlled by a soul insertion, a dark magic technique that put a fragment of a mage's consciousness into a host body and overrode their will. It was a cruder version of what Dorgo had done to Damian himself, and recognizing it produced something in Damian's expression that Victor, watching from behind a tree, found difficult to look at. He destroyed the soul fragment directly, carefully, leaving Ernst shaken but intact. The mid-class knight Sebastian, who had been trapped nearby, was freed without permanent damage. Damian remounted his horse and they continued home. He didn't speak for some time. The Copperhead tournament needed to come first, but Agnes was waiting. She found him at the Gold Pixie estate before the road home, and the way she found him mattered, not seeking him out formally, not sending a message through church channels, but simply appearing at the gate in travel clothes with her staff across her back and a look on her face that suggested she had been calculating the right moment for some time. She told him she was hunting someone. The name was Corpseplay, not a real name, an alias, the kind of title a person takes when they want the world to know what they are. A Yulan necromancer who had earned that name through a particular methodology. He took living people, turned them into flesh golems through a dark magic process that preserved consciousness just long enough to make the transformation agonizing, and treated the results as art. He had been operating across the continent for years. The church had been hunting him for almost as long. Agnes had a personal interest. Her village had been one of his work sites. She had not been present when it happened. She had already left for church training, but she had come home to the aftermath. And her brother had not been among the dead they could identify. She didn't say the rest of it out loud. She didn't need to. Damian understood what remained unspoken, that if her brother's body hadn't been recovered, there was a possibility he was still alive in the worst possible sense of that word. Damian looked at Agnes for a moment. She was good at holding her face still when she didn't want to show something, but not quite good enough. Not with him. He had spent a lifetime reading people in situations where misreading them was fatal. He told her he would help her find Corpseplay when she was ready. She nodded, very precisely, and thanked him in the careful way of someone who doesn't trust their voice with anything more elaborate. The immediate matter was the Copperhead tournament. Abel, Damian's younger brother, bookish and anxious and possessed of a deep, patient affection for Olivia Copperhead that he had been carefully not acting on for years, had been quietly suffering. He was in love with the Count's daughter. The Count would not have approved. The situation had the particular misery of a thing that seems entirely stuck. Damian carried the August bow in his luggage all the way to Count Copperhead's territory. The bow was exceptional. Made from minotaur horn by an artisan whose work was recognized continent-wide, it had a draw weight and precision that made it a collector's object as much as a weapon, the kind of gift that communicated things about the giver that words couldn't easily convey. For Olivia, whose interest in archery was genuine and whose appreciation for fine craftsmanship was real, it would land exactly where Damian intended it to. He handed it to Abel before the birthday banquet and watched his brother's face go through approximately 6 different expressions in 4 seconds. Abel arrived at the banquet and gave Olivia the bow. She held it carefully, tested the draw, looked up at Abel, and smiled in a way that made the rest of the room slightly irrelevant. Count Copperhead watched this from across the hall and began making calculations. The Count was not a man who misread signals. He saw immediately that House Haxon was maneuvering, and he interpreted it correctly as the opening move of something larger. A Viscount's son arriving at his tournament, winning whatever prizes were available, positioning his brother with his daughter. This was a house trying to climb. He found it presumptuous. He found a solution in a man named Jacques Noir. Jacques was a middle-class fighter with a reputation for technique. specifically a technique called the false true mirage sword, a decades-in-development method using thousands of simultaneous blade illusions to overwhelm an opponent's tracking ability. He had spent his life on it. It was genuinely impressive, and Jacques knew it, in the particular way that men who have poured decades into a single achievement know it, completely and defensively, as though the achievement was fragile and required constant protection. The Count arranged with Jacques to eliminate Damian during the tournament's final no-rules event, in exchange for technical secrets and a marriage arrangement involving Olivia that Olivia herself was not consulted about. Olivia found out. She came to Damian's room before the final and told him everything: the arrangement, the plan, the prize at the end of it. She was quiet about it, controlled, but her hands were not entirely still. Damian thanked her and went to sleep. The tournament's monster hunt came first. The local wilderness around Copperhead's territory had been providing a troll problem, large, durable creatures that were destroying farmland and had already killed 3 knights sent to deal with them. The tournament used the monster hunt as an event. Competitors who cleared trolls earned points. Jackson Cutter arrived at the hunt with his usual attitude intact. Jackson was a self-styled ogre slayer, a nickname he had given himself and repeated often enough that his contingent had started using it too, and former fiancé to a young woman named Sophia, who had broken her engagement with Damian years ago specifically to be with him. He was good enough at fighting to believe he was exceptional, which is a precise level of skill that produces a particular kind of person. He cornered a troll, took considerable damage handling it, and eventually brought it down over several labored minutes. Damian found the next troll from the air, having climbed a tree for a better angle, dropped onto it mid-stride, and cut through it in a single passing movement. The creature hit the ground in 2 pieces before the dust settled. He kept walking. His hands were in his pockets. Jackson stared at where the troll had been and said nothing for several seconds. The no-rules final was built for multiple competitors simultaneously. No weapons restrictions, no conduct rules. 1 winner. 6 fighters entered. Damian allowed 5 of them to come at him in coordination, which they did after what appeared to be a quiet pre-arrangement he had noticed forming in the waiting area. He defeated all 5 without drawing his sword, using hand techniques calibrated to be decisive without being lethal, which in a no-rules format was actually the harder discipline. Jackson entered the field after that, and Jackson had a problem. The dark magic pills the Count had quietly arranged through Jacques, enhancement compounds that temporarily elevated a fighter's mana output at a cost to their long-term control, had been slipped into Jackson's pre-match preparation. The Count's plan assumed this would give Jackson enough raw power to close the gap. It did produce raw power. What it also produced was a mana rampage, a state where the enhancement exceeds the fighter's ability to regulate it, and the excess begins tearing through them from the inside. Jackson fought through it. He was genuinely strong enough that even destabilized, even burning internally, he pushed hard. He landed strikes. He used his best techniques. The fight cost Damian more than the previous 5 combined, and Damian let it cost him rather than ending it early, because ending it early meant Jackson's condition went unwitnessed. He brought Jackson down eventually and signaled the church representatives present, Agnes was ringside, to the dark magic compound immediately. The Count watched his plan unravel from the elevated box. Afterward, Damian climbed to the box. He sat across from Count Copperhead with the polite expression of a man who has all day and walked through the accounting, the dark magic enhancement given to a tournament competitor, the conspiracy with Jacques Noir, the plan to kill a visiting nobleman on his territory, and the proposed marriage arrangement made without his daughter's consent. He had documentation on the Jacques arrangement, a letter he had found rather than been given, through methods he didn't elaborate on. The church compound on Jackson's condition was still being processed, but would take approximately 1 day to confirm. He told the Count what he wanted. Olivia's marriage to Abel, approved in writing. 300 gold, compensating for the costs of the scheme, and half the Count's territory ceded to Olivia herself, so that she had something of her own that did not depend on her father's goodwill. The Count's face was a careful neutral throughout this. He was experienced enough to know when he had lost a negotiation before it began. He signed. Jacques was waiting on the road home. He had not been at the formal settlement. He had watched from a distance as his arrangement with the Count collapsed, as his student Jackson was carried off the field, and as Damian walked out of the tournament, having apparently won without drawing his weapon. He had come to the road with his full fighting method ready and a clear idea of what he intended to do. The The prize from the final was a fire spirit heart, a rare alchemical artifact that could absorb and store elemental mana. Jacques wanted it. He also, Damian suspected, needed to do something with what he was feeling about the whole day. He declared himself, explained his technique, and began. The false true mirage sword produced thousands of simultaneous blade illusions, a visual cascade that overwhelmed normal tracking and made it nearly impossible to identify the real attack among the copies. Against an ordinary high-class fighter, it would have worked completely. Damian watched the first full iteration, filed it, and reproduced it. Not a rough approximation, a complete reproduction, thousands of illusions matching thousands. The technique Jacques had spent his entire adult life developing, replicated in a single observation, because Damian's memory worked that way, and always had. He had been doing this since his Death Knight years. Every technique he faced, once, became his permanently. The look on Jacques' face in that moment was one that Damian recognized. He had seen it before, on other faces, in other fights. The expression of someone who has just understood something devastating. He ended the fight quickly after that. Jacques had been a threat. He was no longer a threat. Damian didn't draw it out. Olivia moved into the Haxon estate shortly after. She arrived with a single trunk and the bow, and a specific quality of relief on her face that she managed to keep mostly private. Abel was waiting at the gate. Victor had somehow produced flower arrangements at short notice. Louise had prepared the best guest room. Paul stood at the door with a formality that didn't quite hide that he was pleased. Damian watched this from the upper landing for a moment, then went to find his traveling clothes. Agnes was waiting at an inn on the Eastern Road with the paladin Margata and a church strike squad. They had spent 3 months compiling intelligence on Corpse Play's location, a mountain fortress built into a series of natural caverns, reinforced with dark magic, and populated with the results of his work. The operation was ready. Agnes had simply been waiting for Damian. He arrived a day after Olivia moved in. Agnes looked at him when he rode up and didn't say anything, which he interpreted correctly as meaning she was grateful he had come. The mountain dungeon was not designed to be infiltrated from the outside. It didn't need to be. Corpse Play's real defense was what lived inside. The flesh golems, the traps of dark magic that responded to unfamiliar mana signatures, and the deliberate architecture of the cavern system that funneled intruders into corridors where they could be managed. The paladin squad moved carefully. Margata was competent and kept her people disciplined. Agnes moved through the dark with the focused intensity of someone who had been preparing for this specific day for years. They were deep in the 3rd level of the cavern when the trap closed. It came from inside the party. A senior paladin named Sanis, decorated, trusted, with decades of service, turned and attacked her own squad. She was not compromised by dark magic in the way Ernst had been. She was a true believer in something Damian had encountered before, the radical faction within the church that had concluded dark magic was not merely a threat to be contained, but a power to be redirected, that the Archlight's teachings had become too conservative, that the old forbidden methods needed to be reclaimed rather than suppressed. She had waited until they were deep enough that retreat was difficult, then activated a stack of enhancement techniques layered over months of preparation. Damian had one functional advantage, the fire spirit heart he had taken as the tournament prize. He absorbed it, pulled the stored mana directly into his cultivation system, and felt his reserves recover from the depletion the cavern's pressure had been grinding into him. The fight with Sanis was not short. She was exceptional. Years of paladin training plus months of illegal enhancement plus the prepared environment and the element of complete surprise. She had stacked every advantage she could identify. She hit Damian 3 times before he read her enhancement structure clearly enough to work around it. He beat her eventually, thoroughly, and left her for the church representatives to collect. Agnes found her brother on the 4th level. The flesh golem called Kite was the largest construct in the chamber, a mass of body horror that Corpse Play had apparently considered a masterpiece. It moved with heavy, wrong-proportioned violence, and had already killed 2 of the support squad before Agnes identified what she was looking at. She recognized the eyes. They were her brother's eyes. The same shape, the same color, the same slightly worried quality that her brother had always had when he was about to say something he wasn't sure of. They were the only part of him that was still him, set in a body that bore no other resemblance to the person she had grown up with. She stopped moving. The golem stopped too. Something in the consciousness trapped inside it recognized her, fought through the layers of necromantic control toward the surface, and her brother looked at her from inside something terrible and found, somehow, enough of himself to say goodbye. Agnes's hands went flat against her sides. The divine power that the Holy Church called stigmata, a blessing granted to individuals of extraordinary faith and sacrifice, so rare that Agnes had heard of it only in doctrinal texts, never witnessed, rose through her without warning and without permission. It looked like light but landed in the room like grief, filling every corner of the chamber with something that had no appropriate category. Her brother's consciousness found peace. The golem collapsed. Agnes stood in the aftermath with the stigmata fading off her hands and her eyes closed, and Damian 3 feet away, not touching her, not speaking, simply there. He gave her the time she needed. That was all he could do, and he knew it. Corpse play was on the 5th level. He was not what Damian expected, physically. A slight, older man surrounded by his work, moving through the chamber with the comfortable manner of someone in their private studio. He knew the squad had come. He had been watching through his constructs. He found the whole thing mildly interesting. He made a speech about craft, about the unique challenge of creating art from materials that resisted transformation, about how the viewer's discomfort was itself an intended component of the experience. He used the word masterpiece 3 times without irony. Damian listened, identified the 3 active dark magic constructs woven into the room's architecture, dismantled them through his greed absorption in the time it took corpse play to finish the speech, and then sealed the necromancer's soul, a technique from his Death Knight years that he had hoped never to use on a person, but found appropriate here. With the soul sealed, corpse play's connection to his golem severed and his defense structure collapsed. What remained was a man standing in his own chamber, surrounded by the things he had made, with every dark magic tool suddenly inaccessible. The vengeful spirits came on their own. They were already in the room. They had been in the room all along, attached to the constructs they had been trapped inside. When the seal went up and corpse play's control dissolved, they did not disperse. They turned. Damian watched it happen. He did not intervene. The man's screaming, when it started, was genuine. The sound of someone experiencing exactly what he had specialized in creating. He decapitated corpse play at the end of it, when the screaming stopped, as a formality. He wasn't sure whether it was mercy or bookkeeping. He decided it didn't matter and moved on. There was a room behind the chamber, a hidden space behind a false wall that Damian found because the mana signature behind it was inconsistent with the cavern's natural stonework. Inside was a creature that didn't have a clean classification. Part human, part something else. The result of one of corpse play's experiments in a direction he apparently hadn't published as finished work. She was small, frightened, and had been in that room for an indeterminate length of time. She looked at Damian from the far corner, with eyes that were not entirely the right shape, and made no sound at all. He crouched down to her level and told her she wasn't in danger anymore. She didn't move for a long time. Then she moved a little closer. He named her Mia, which was the name of a cat he had owned in a previous life, and brought her out of the cavern. Victor, who had waited at the dungeon entrance because Damian had told him to, took one look at Mia and immediately decided she needed to be wrapped in his coat. Agnes looked at Mia on the ride down the mountain and said nothing, but her expression settled into something softer than it had been all day. The months that followed were work. Corpse Play had been one node in the Yulan network, not the whole thing. His dungeon had been a base, and bases left records, logistics routes, contact lists, supply arrangements, the operational vocabulary of an organization that had been running dark magic operations across the continent for decades. Damian spent the better part of 3 months using what he had recovered from the dungeon to track down Yulan outposts one at a time. He developed an unintended reputation. The alias came from Victor, who could not be stopped from narrating their activities to anyone who would listen at inns and roadhouses. The story as Victor told it involved Damian arriving at dark mage strongholds with no particular expression and dismantling them with the methodical thoroughness of someone clearing deadwood. The name that stuck was Wood Chopping Victor, which Damian found irritating and Victor found pleasing. It spread faster than he would have liked. He found the demonic sword Erebus at a dark magic hideout on the 4th hunt. Erebus was not a weapon in the conventional sense, not entirely. It was an artifact that had been growing, accumulating the dark mana of every environment it had been stored in for years, developing something approaching consciousness through the accumulation. Damian had encountered it in his first life, briefly, and recognized it the moment he entered the room where it was stored. The sword recognized something back. He took it, wrapped it in resonance-dampening cloth, and carried it. On the same circuit, in a mountain pass 3 days east of the 4th hideout, he encountered Karl Hopper. Karl was the Mercenary King, a title that had more weight than most formal noble ranks, earned through decades of combat that had taken him through every conflict on the continent. He was a high-class knight at the absolute ceiling of that tier, pressing against the threshold of masterclass in a way that very few ever managed. He had a daughter who competed in prestigious tournaments under her own name, which would become relevant shortly. Karl looked at Damian on the mountain road with the particular attention that a fighter of his level gave to things that registered as interesting threats. Damian looked at Karl with the particular attention of someone who had studied Karl's file in his first life and knew exactly how the man fought. They didn't engage. Karl nodded slightly. Damian nodded back. They continued in opposite directions. It was the kind of meeting that both parties understood would have a sequel. The Helen tournament was held in the Helios Empire, a multi-nation event that drew competitors from across the continent and served as one of the primary mechanisms for establishing continental reputation. Paul had been building toward a scolding about Damian's 3-month absence when Damian deflected the whole conversation by proposing the tournament as the solution to House Haxon's remaining social standing problems. A Viscount's son winning a continental tournament was worth considerably more than a Viscount's son's word. Paul stared at him. Then he authorized the travel funds. Victor packed with extreme thoroughness. Mia traveled in a specially constructed carrying arrangement that Victor had commissioned from a local craftsman. The road to the Helios Empire took 2 weeks, during which Damian trained and Victor narrated observations about the landscape to Mia, who tolerated this with apparent patience. The tournament was divided by class: apprentice, official, and high-class divisions, plus a special exhibition category for invited guests. Damian entered the high-class division, which drew the strongest independent fighters and noble champions from across the participating nations. The opening rounds were administrative. Damian moved through them with a level of effort that alarmed his opponents and confused the commentators, who were accustomed to high-class tournament fighters working through their matches with more visible strain. The match against Athena came in the 5th round. Athena was Karl Hopper's daughter, which Damian had known, which was why he had been expecting her energy signature since the draw was announced. She was legitimately exceptional. High class at the peak of the tier, pushing the same threshold her father occupied, and equipped with a fighting style that had been refined through years of competing against her father's private instruction, which meant she had been trained against someone who was nearly masterclass. She was the tournament favorite. Every betting pool had her winning it. She entered the match with an opening sequence that cleared a 100-meter radius of the arena floor with the shockwave, which impressed the crowd and gave Damian a clean read on her core technique's foundations. He scored 100 points, the maximum in the evaluation system, which measured damage output, technique diversity, defense integrity, and recovery speed over the duration of the match. He achieved this while keeping his feet mostly stationary in the center of the arena floor. Athena, at the end of the match, sat on the arena floor for a moment. Then she stood up, walked to the center, and proposed marriage. Not as a formality, not as a cultural performance. She told him directly that she wanted children who would fight well and that he was the correct candidate. Her expression throughout was entirely serious. She was the daughter of the Mercenary King and had apparently inherited his direct approach to goal setting. Damian declined. She proposed again. He declined again, with slightly more elaboration. She received this with the focused expression of someone filing information rather than accepting a result, and walked off the arena floor to considerable noise from the stands. Victor, watching from the spectator area, had covered his face with both hands. The tournament's disruption came from outside the official bracket. Pandemonium was a dark magic organization that operated differently from Yulan. Where Yulan specialized in manipulation and infiltration, Pandemonium was explicitly martial, built around fighters who incorporated dark power into their combat methods rather than using it as a tool of social control. They sent a representative to the Helen tournament not to compete through the registration process, but to demonstrate a point. Javier was a dark knight of Pandemonium, the son of the masterclass fighter Gray, who led the organization's enforcement arm. He entered the arena during Michael Lion Bloom's semifinal match, used a soul-stealing dark blade to injure Michael in a way that bypassed conventional defense, and qualified himself for the finals by a logic that the tournament officials found themselves unable to counter in real time. He was also, even without the Dark Blade, genuinely dangerous. The combination of Pandemonium's fighting tradition and the stolen soul energy made him a mid to high class threat even before the enhancement. Damian watched the semifinals from the stands, tracked Javier's technique foundations, and went to sleep at his normal time. The final the following morning started cleanly enough. They were well matched in the opening exchanges, or appeared to be. Damian was reading Javier's full capability rather than his own, holding back while he catalogued. Javier was aware he wasn't seeing a complete picture, and responded by escalating. He demonized. It was the word the Pandemonium organization used for a full dark energy integration, a process that temporarily fused the fighter's body with accumulated demonic power, multiplying output at the cost of control and long-term physical damage. In demonized state, Javier was genuinely above the normal high-class ceiling. He was pushing into the lower range of masterclass, and he was doing it in the middle of a public arena in front of an imperial audience. Before Damian could respond to the escalation, Gray arrived. He came through the arena wall. Masterclass fighters existed in a different category from everyone beneath them, not a greater degree of the same thing, but a qualitatively different kind of force. Gray's opening movement split the arena floor from wall to wall and sent stone fragments the size of cartwheels into the stands. His second movement found Damian across 50 meters of chaos. The strike landed. Damian was conscious for approximately 3 seconds after it connected. Long enough to register the ground, long enough to feel the specific quality of force that separated a masterclass hit from anything else he had ever absorbed. Long enough to understand that his body's current development, still recovering, still building toward what it had been, had not been sufficient to receive that strike and remain functional. Then the world went away. He woke up in the Emperor's medical ward with Agnes sitting at the foot of his bed and Athena standing at the window with her arms crossed and an expression that she would not have described as worried, but was. The Emperor of Helios was a man who understood optics. A Pandemonium operative had publicly demonstrated masterclass violence inside his premier tournament. His response needed to be proportionate and visible. He presented Damian with the Chimera armor, Imperial-grade equipment developed from materials that could withstand masterclass force, and the formal status of a tournament champion, which carried continental recognition. The armor was exceptional. Damian tested its properties carefully, calibrated how it interacted with his own mana output, and spent 2 days recovering his baseline physical function. On the third day, the tracking work Agnes had been doing quietly since Gray's exit from the arena produced results. Gray had not fled the Empire. He was below it, in the old sewer infrastructure beneath the Imperial District, a network of tunnels that had been used historically as escape routes and storage, and had, at some point, been taken over as a Pandemonium-safe location. The three of them went down into the sewers in the early hours of the fourth morning. Agnes carried her staff and the contained power of her stigmata. Athena moved with the controlled efficiency of someone who had been trained by Karl Hopper since she could walk. Damian wore the Chimera armor and carried the Thousand-League sword. They found Gray in the largest chamber, a vaulted space where the old drainage channels opened into a central basin, the water long gone, the stone floor dry and scarred. Gray was waiting. He had known they were coming. He was holding Javier. Not Javier the fighter, not Javier who had demonized in the arena. Javier had completed the process that had been implicit in his demonization. He had sacrificed the remainder of his physical existence to transform entirely into a weapon. The demonic sword in Gray's hand was his son, condensed and restructured. The accumulated power of years of Pandemonium training converted to a blade that resonated with a frequency Damian had never encountered in his first life. Gray didn't speak. He moved. Agnes's barriers held for 2 exchanges. On the third, they shattered. Athena's counterattack landed and was redirected so efficiently that the force of it folded back through her own defense, dropping her to one knee. Damian closed the gap using the Chimera armor's impact absorption properties and landed 3 strikes that would have ended any opponent below masterclass level. Gray didn't flinch. He caught Damian's weapon with his bare hand, applied a force that ran up the blade and through the hilt, and the Thousand-League sword broke apart at the guard. The grip that followed closed around Damian's throat and lifted him. His feet left the ground. The Chimera armor screamed with absorbed impact and gave him 3 seconds of protection before its limits would be reached. His weapon was in pieces on the sewer floor. Agnes was down. Athena was struggling to stand. And beneath the sound of Gray's killing intent, beneath the creak of the armor, beneath the rushing noise that compressed atmosphere made next to his ears, Damian heard something else. A call. Low, resonant, deeply familiar. The demonic sword Erebus had been at his side all along, wrapped in its dampening cloth, carried through the entire fight, ignored in favor of the Thousand-League Sword, because the Thousand-League Sword had been the safer choice. Erebus was not a safe choice. Erebus was still growing, still accumulating, still developing toward whatever it was becoming, and drawing on it before that process was complete carried risks he had assessed and set aside in favor of a calmer option. The calmer option was broken on the floor. His free hand closed around the wrapped hilt. He pulled the cloth away. The blade's resonance hit the chamber like a sustained note from a very deep instrument, and Gray's grip on his throat hesitated. A fraction of a second, an involuntary response to a frequency that even a masterclass fighter's body registered as significant. Damian's arm came forward. The cut began. Gray did not fall immediately. That was the first thing Damian understood as the blade connected. That even with Erebus singing through the chamber at a frequency that made the sewer walls shed dust from their seams, even with the cut landing clean and the dark resonance of the sword doing what it was built to do, Gray was still masterclass. The wound opened across his shoulder and chest, and the force behind it drove him back 3 full steps, releasing Damian's throat. But he did not go down. He absorbed it the way mountains absorb weather, taking damage, registering it, remaining fundamentally intact. Damian's feet hit the floor. He breathed. Gray looked at the wound. He looked at Erebus. Something moved behind his eyes that was not fear, but was adjacent to it. The recognition of a thing that should not exist in the hands of an opponent he had assessed as manageable. He attacked again. The exchange that followed was the fastest Damian had fought since his Death Knight years. Gray's technique at full expression was exactly what a masterclass fighter's technique looked like when stripped of restraint. Not complicated, not decorated, but operating at a force and speed that made complexity irrelevant. Every movement he made was a direct line from his body to the most critical point on Damian's. No wasted arc. No performance. Just the arithmetic of violence calculated by someone who had spent decades past the point where skill needed to be thought about. Damian didn't try to match it cleanly. He couldn't, not yet. His body was still months of training away from the tier where matching it directly was viable, and he knew the gap precisely. What he had instead was something Gray had not built his entire fighting life accounting for, a memory that contained every martial technique the world had produced, and a sword that was actively consuming the dark energy Gray was outputting to empower his strikes. Erebus drank it. Every exchange where the blades connected, every shockwave of dark force that Gray sent through the air, the sword absorbed and converted, feeding back into the resonance that made Gray's own body hesitate at the contact point. It was not enough to stop a masterclass fighter. It was enough to slow the exchanges by the fraction of a second that Damian needed to redirect rather than receive. Agnes recovered enough to create a containment barrier around the chamber's exits. Not an attack, not even a meaningful defense, but a signal that she was still functional, and that Gray's escape route had a cost now. Athena got to her feet and came back in from the left side. She was hurt. She came back in anyway, using a pressure angle that forced Gray to divide his attention even if her attacks were not landing with full effect. The 3 of them worked the chamber. Not as a coordinated unit in the way trained squads worked. They had not fought together enough for that, but as 3 separate problems Gray had to manage simultaneously, each pulling at a different axis, none of them individually sufficient, but collectively requiring more processing than even a masterclass mind could fully optimize. Gray made a choice. He prioritized Damian and Erebus. It was the correct choice. Erebus was the only thing in the chamber that was actually threatening him at the level his body understood as threat. Agnes's stigmata-touched barriers were a structural nuisance. Athena's high-class ceiling meant her strikes landed like significant impacts rather than potentially decisive ones. But Erebus, still developing, still only partly awake, was producing resonance that Gray's body recognized from somewhere older than his training, some deep register where dark energy understood its own dissolution. He came at Damian with everything. Damian moved with the armor and the sword and the memory of 10,000 fights, and let the impact come, accepted the force through the Chimera armor's limits, felt his ribs flex against material that was designed to flex rather than break, and put the blade through Gray's guard in the half-second that full commitment always opened. The cut was deeper this time. It ran from Gray's left collarbone diagonally across his chest, through the dark energy channeling points that a pandemonium fighter used to sustain their enhancement, and Gray's power output dropped by half between one breath and the next. He landed. Both of them had landed. The chamber was very quiet, except for Agnes murmuring something in church Latin and the sound of Erebus settling into a lower resonance as the dark energy in the room thinned. Gray stood. He was still standing. He was bleeding from 2 wounds that would have killed anyone below his tier, and he was still standing, which told Damian everything he needed to know about the distance remaining between a strong high-class fighter and the real masterclass ceiling. But he was no longer attacking. He looked at Damian, at Erebus, at the 3 of them arranged in the chamber, exhausted, hurt, but positioned. He looked at Javier, the demonic sword in his own hand, his son converted to a weapon, and Damian saw something happen in Gray's face that had nothing to do with the fight's tactical situation. Gray was a father holding his dead child, and the arithmetic was becoming clear. He lowered the blade. Not surrender, not formally, not in any way that could be recorded or held as a concession. He simply stopped. He looked at Damian for a long moment with an expression that contained things Damian recognized, because grief had its own vocabulary that transcended rank and organization and ideology, and then he stepped back toward the far wall of the chamber. Agnes's barriers were still up at the exits. Gray looked at them. He could have pushed through. With the 2 wounds, diminished as he was, it would have cost him, but it was possible. Instead, he stood still. Damian let him stand there. He did not press. He understood, without being able to explain the calculus of it to anyone who asked, that the fight was over in the way that mattered. Gray was not surrendering to the Helios Empire. He was not going to be handed to the church or the Emperor's court, or any of the formal structures that would have loved to have him. He was going to leave this sewer, and Damian was going to let him, and the reason was not mercy in the soft sense of the word. It was the harder thing. The recognition that a man holding what remained of his son had already been in a place beyond winning and losing for longer than the fight had lasted. He nodded once to Agnes. She let the barriers drop. Gray walked out. Athena watched him go with her jaw set. She was the daughter of the mercenary king, and she had been raised in a tradition where outcomes were measured in clear wins and clear losses. She did not say anything, which was its own kind of statement. Agnes looked at Damian. He picked up the pieces of the Thousand-League sword from the floor, tucked them inside the Hemera armor's storage compartment, and began the walk back toward the surface. The official version of the events in the sewer was managed by the Helios Emperor's court, with the particular efficiency of an institution that understood the relationship between what had happened and what it was useful for people to believe had happened. The tournament's conclusion was publicly recorded as a victory for Damian Haxon of House Haxon, representing a foreign noble family in an open continental competition. The pandemonium incident was framed as a disruption that had been contained by the Emperor's forces with assistance from visiting competitors. Gray's name did not appear in the documentation. The Emperor conducted a private audience the morning after the sewer engagement. He was a man in his late 50s who wore authority the way people do when they have had it long enough that it stopped requiring conscious maintenance. Naturally, without effort, and with the specific weight that comes from knowing that most of the people in a room will do what he says. He looked at Damian across a table that had probably been older than most of the noble houses in the room, and asked one direct question. He wanted to know what Damian wanted. Not in the tournament, not in the empire, not in the formal category of prizes and titles. What Damian Haxon actually wanted, at the level where ambitious young men had real answers they didn't usually say out loud. Damian told him. He wanted dark magic eliminated from the continent. The networks, the organizations, the supply chains, the hiding places. He wanted the political structures that allowed dark magic sects to operate in the shadows of legitimate noble houses dismantled. He was not asking for imperial resources to do it, and he was not asking for formal authorization. He was explaining what he intended to do so that the Emperor could decide in advance whether that was a problem. The Emperor looked at him for a while. He said that was an ambitious goal for a Viscount's son. Damian agreed that it was. The Emperor poured 2 cups of tea, which he made himself at a small side table rather than calling for a servant, and slid one across. He said that if House Haxon's work continued to produce results consistent with what he had observed, the Empire would be interested in a formal consultation relationship. Not patronage, he was specific about that distinction. consultation. He was interested in competence, and competence was rare enough that he didn't require it to come packaged in a traditional political structure. They drank their tea. Neither man said anything else that required saying. Damian returned to the inn where Victor had been keeping Mia company for 4 days. Victor had apparently narrated the entire 4 days to her in considerable detail. Mia had developed the habit of sitting on Victor's left shoulder, which Victor bore with an expression of deep satisfaction. Agnes found him on the inn's roof that evening. She had cleaned up and changed, and the stigmata residue that had been visible on her hands for days after the dungeon had finally faded completely. She sat down next to him without asking, which was a habit she had developed without either of them remarking on it. The gradual erosion of the formality that usually governed interactions between a paladin representative and a noble, replaced by something more honest and considerably less comfortable to examine closely. She told him she had filed her report on the corpse play mission. The church had acknowledged the stigmata manifestation and was sending a senior examiner to assess her status, which was both an honor and a bureaucratic imposition she could have done without. She told him the examiner would arrive in approximately 6 weeks at her main station, and that she would need to be there. Damian said that was fine. She looked at him with the specific expression she used when she was deciding whether to say something she had been not saying for some time. It was a look he had catalogued without being able to do anything useful with, because the situation it represented was one he had been maintaining careful distance from for reasons that were good reasons, and that he nonetheless found increasingly tiresome to maintain. She said she would find him when the examination was done. He said he expected she would. She left the roof. Damian stayed up there for a while looking at the city lights of the Helios Empire spread out below him, the largest city he had visited in this second life, 10 times the size of his home district, a place he had passed through in his first life as a weapon, and was passing through now as something more complicated. Athena appeared at the roof access about an hour later. She sat down on his other side, which he had not invited but also hadn't blocked the access to, and was quiet for approximately 4 minutes, which was the longest he had heard her be quiet. Then she said that she had spoken to her father about him. Damian waited. She said Carl had said he was interesting. She delivered this as though it were a significant piece of information, which in the context of what Karl Hopper's assessments usually produced, it was. She also said she was still planning to marry him, which she wanted him to factor into his future planning. He said he would consider it. She seemed to find this response more encouraging than he had intended it to be, and departed the roof with the air of someone who had accomplished something. The road home from the Helios Empire took longer than the road there. Not in distance, the route was the same. But Damian was working, and working slowly was less efficient than working all at once, which meant he stopped 3 times at Yulan-adjacent locations that the intelligence from the sewer engagement had identified as worth examining. 2 of them were genuine. One was a storage depot that had already been emptied. Someone had tipped it, which meant the information networks were faster than he had hoped. The other was an active processing site for the soul fragment insertion technique, the same method that had been used on Ernst. He dismantled it with Agnes's documentation crew and took everything the site's records contained. Victor handled all food preparation during these stops and managed Mia's travel arrangements with a thoroughness that Damian found genuinely impressive, given that Victor had not previously demonstrated logistical ability at this level. When asked about it, Victor said that Mia required consistent care, and that consistent care required planning, and that planning was something he had apparently always been capable of but had not previously been motivated to perform. Damian told him this was good to know. Victor nodded solemnly and produced a map he had annotated himself. House Haxon, when he returned, had changed in the specific way that a household changes when it has stopped bracing for the next blow and started believing things might be all right. Paul was managing the mine arrangement funds with the focused energy of a man who had been told he had more resources than he had thought, and was now doing 5 years of deferred maintenance on his household's affairs simultaneously. He acknowledged Damian's return with a nod across the breakfast table that contained more warmth than any formal greeting he had produced in Damian's entire first life, then went back to his documents. Louise had reorganized the household staff, which she had apparently needed authority to do for years, and which had been implicitly granted by the change in House Haxon's standing. She was better at it than anyone had given her credit for, methodical, fair, and capable of a particular firm clarity when someone wasn't performing that left no room for argument without being unkind about it. She had been managing things behind the scenes for years, Damian realized. The disgraceful eldest son had provided enough chaos that no one had noticed how well the second child was holding everything together. She hugged him when he walked in the door. She had always been warmer than she let most people see, openly affectionate with family, carefully contained with everyone else, a result of having learned that warmth was something some people tried to use against you. With Damian, she didn't bother with the guard anymore. She pressed her face briefly into his shoulder, said she had been worried, and then stepped back and told him dinner was at 6th bell and that Victor needed to stop bringing Mia into the kitchen because the cook was losing her composure. Abel and Olivia were in the study working on something together, a shared project of some kind, their heads bent over the same table, voices low. They were comfortable together in the specific way that people become comfortable when they have stopped performing the early stages of a relationship and settled into the actual one. Abel looked up when Damian appeared in the doorway, seemed to search for words, and settled on thanking him in a way that covered everything he meant without specifying any of it. Olivia said that she had started cataloging the household's defensive equipment because no one else had done it, and the inventory was genuinely alarming. Damian told her she was welcome and asked her to include the storage ring contents when she had a moment. She had already done it. She handed him a list. He looked at it, then looked at her, and thought that his brother had made an excellent choice. The weeks at home had a different texture from anything that had preceded them in either life. He trained every morning, but the training was different now. Less desperate recovery work, more deliberate advancement toward the tier his memory told him he needed to reach. The Chimera armor's properties interacted with his cultivation method in ways he was still mapping, creating feedback loops that accelerated his physical development when he worked against its resistance rather than within it. His stamina had crossed the threshold he had identified as the minimum viable baseline. His mana control was approaching what his teenage body's channels could currently support. He was still high class. Master class was months away at minimum, possibly more. He knew the number with reasonable precision because he had been both and understood the gap. There were problems that required that gap to be closed. Gray was still out there. Gray was diminished, grieving, potentially less focused than before, but a damaged masterclass fighter was still a masterclass fighter, and Pandemonium had other people at Gray's level who had not been in the Helen tournament. The Emperor's information on the organization's leadership structure had included 2 names Damian was keeping in the back of his mind. The Archlich Dorgo was the real answer to the question of what came next. Not Yulan, not Pandemonium, not the dozen small dark magic sects that the continent had acquired over the centuries the way houses acquire dust, present, irritating, occasionally dangerous, manageable. Dorgo was the source. The regents of every dark magic tradition on the continent traced their methods back to the same foundational works, and those works traced back to Dorgo's original research from an era so remote that most scholars had recategorized it as mythology. Dorgo had not been destroyed when Damian destroyed the Horde. He understood this now in a way he had not understood it in the first chaotic days of his regression. He had broken the binding, collapsed the undead army, and severed the connection. But an Archlich of that age did not have a single point of failure. The soul anchor he had used was not his only anchor. He had been placed in the position of needing to be very dead, which he currently was not. He was dormant somewhere, recovering. The recovery timeline was something Damian had been calculating in quiet moments, and the answer was not comfortable. He had time, not unlimited time, but time, enough to build what he needed to build before the next confrontation had to happen. The issue that surfaced before the larger problems had a chance to develop was more immediate and came from a direction he had been tracking peripherally. The Church's examination of Agnes's stigmata manifestation produced an outcome that the senior examiner clearly had not expected to produce. The stigmata was real, fully realized, not a partial manifestation, not a temporary phenomenon linked to the specific crisis conditions of the dungeon. Agnes had become one of approximately 7 paladins on the continent with an active stigmata, which put her in a category of significance that the Church's administrative structure had difficulty processing because it happened so rarely. The examiner wanted her recalled to the main church chapter house for formal elevation and assignment. The elevation came with title, resources, and a mission structure that would give Agnes considerably more capability to pursue the kind of dark magic investigations she had been running. It also came with assignments that the church chose rather than Agnes. She sent him a letter about it. It was a long letter for someone who normally communicated precisely and briefly. She explained the situation in detail, described the church's proposed assignment framework, noted that the first assignment they had suggested would take her to the Northern Territories for approximately a year, and at the end of the letter, after a paragraph that was clearly written and then rewritten based on the uneven pressure of the ink, said that she had told them she had a prior commitment to assist in dark magic investigations with House Haxon and asked whether that was still accurate. She was asking permission to stay. Or asking, at least, for a reason that would hold up to church scrutiny. Damian sat with the letter for a while. He thought about the things he was careful about and why he was careful about them. He thought about Agnes in the dungeon, and Agnes on the inn roof, and Agnes in a dozen smaller moments that he had been filing away in the same memory system that stored sword techniques and dark magic counters, which was perhaps not the most organized approach to that kind of information. He wrote back. The letter was shorter than hers. He confirmed that the commitment was accurate, described the specific pandemonium intelligence they were still working through from the sewer engagement, noted the 2 names from the Emperor's briefing that would benefit from church-level investigation access, and at the end added 1 line that he did not rewrite. He said he was glad she had found him in the first place. He sent it and went back to training. She arrived a month later with a formal church letter authorizing her extended field investigation under her own discretion, which she handed to Victor at the gate, because Damian was in the middle of his morning training, and she didn't want to interrupt it. Victor read the letter, looked at her, looked at where Damian was working in the courtyard, and produced an expression that contained an entire editorial he was visibly restraining himself from delivering. He showed her to the same guest room Agnes had used the one time she had stayed previously. Louise had kept it prepared, which was a detail Agnes noticed, and filed away without commenting on. Damian came in from training an hour later and found Agnes in the kitchen with Louise, engaged in a conversation about the Paladin Chapter House's record-keeping system that had apparently evolved from a question about ink types and was now covering administrative redundancy in church documentation. Louise was interested in the answer in the way organized people are interested in systems that are less organized than they should be. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Agnes looked up. Their eyes met in the way they had been meeting for months, which was a specific quality of meeting that contained more information than either of them had formally agreed to exchange. She said good morning. He said good morning. Louise looked between them with an expression she was controlling and went back to her documentation question. The next month had the quality of a foundation being laid, not the dramatic structure of an arc, no immediate crisis, no countdown to a confrontation, just the careful accumulation of capability and intelligence and trust that the next stage was going to require. Agnes's church connections opened information channels that Damian's individual investigations couldn't reach. Athena wrote twice from the Mercenary King's circuit, both letters containing useful intelligence about pandemonium movements in the Northern Territories, and one casual marriage proposal appended to the second, like a postscript she had added without entirely thinking about it. Abel and Olivia were quiet and steady in the way of something solid being built. Paul continued his documents. Louise continued her management, and began, in small, careful steps, accepting social invitations that she had avoided for years because the household's reputation had made them complicated. The reputation was no longer complicated. Victor learned to cook 3 dishes specifically for Mia's dietary requirements, and documented the process as though it would eventually be important historical information. Damian trained. He read the intelligence files. He mapped the Dorgo recovery timeline against his own development timeline and the gap between them, with a precision that was useful, even if the precision was uncomfortable. He maintained the distance he had been maintaining, and then one evening didn't, entirely, in the specific way that things that have been careful for a long time become briefly less careful, a conversation that went later than conversations usually went. A moment in the garden where the gap between people who have been near each other for months closed in a way that was not a decision so much as an outcome, and Agnes looked at him with the expression she used when she had decided something. He did not step back, she did not qualify it or retract it in the morning, neither did he. The threat that had been developing in the north moved faster than his projection had allowed for. He received 3 pieces of intelligence in the same week, from 3 separate sources: Agnes's church network, the Emperor's consultation letter, and a trader who had come through the mountain passes with news from the northern settlements, and all 3 said the same thing in different vocabularies. The dark energy activity in the Northern Territories had increased by a factor that passive background levels did not produce. Someone was using a significant amount of dark magic in a concentrated area over an extended period. And the only reason to do that was preparation. The same way armies moved supplies before they moved soldiers. His development timeline and Dorgo's recovery timeline had been a gap. The gap had shortened faster than he had calculated. He spread the intelligence reports on the study table, and Agnes stood next to him, and they looked at the maps. The concentration point was in the northern mountain range, in a region that had been uninhabited since a plague event 2 generations ago, which was, he thought, not a coincidence. Plague events 2 generations ago that emptied regions were frequently not plague events. He needed to move faster. He also needed to not move so fast that he walked into a situation his current tier couldn't handle, which was a precise balance that required honest assessment of where he actually was, rather than where he needed to be. He went to find Paul. His father was at his desk, as he usually was at this hour, surrounded by the documents of a viscountcy that was in the process of becoming considerably more complicated than it had been. Paul looked up when Damian came in, and his expression settled into the careful neutral he used when he suspected he was about to receive information that would require him to adjust a significant assumption. Damian sat down across from him. He told his father the full truth of what was coming, not the daily intelligence and not the tactical situation, but the real shape of it. That there was an archlick in the north recovering from a first-life defeat he had played a role in. That the dark magic sects were connected to that recovery in the way rivers are connected to a single source. And that the confrontation that his second life had been preparation for was entering its approach phase. Paul listened to all of it without interrupting, which Damian had not been entirely certain he would manage. When he finished, Paul was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands on the desk. He looked at the documents around him. The mine records, the marriage registrations, the social correspondence that represented the shape of a household finally moving in the right direction. He looked at his son. He said he had known, for some time, that Damian was not simply a talented young man who had grown up quickly. He had not known the full shape of it. He was not going to pretend the shape of it didn't concern him. But he said he trusted Damian. Not because fathers trust sons automatically. Paul had not been that kind of father in either life, but because he had watched Damian make decisions across the past year, and the decisions had been right, and a man who makes decisions that are right under pressure is a man whose judgment can be relied on. He asked what House Haxon needed to do. Damian told him. The household needed to establish secondary residence, not flight, not retreat, but a distributed presence that meant a single strike couldn't end everything at once. Abel needed to continue his training, not because Abel was going to be a frontline fighter, but because a capable household required capable members. Louise needed to know the full situation too. Paul nodded to each point. He made notes on a separate piece of paper. Then he said one more thing. He said he was sorry for the first life, not because he knew the specifics, but because he had learned enough in this one to understand the shape of what the first must have been, and he wanted his son to know that he understood the weight of what had been carried. Damian looked at his father for a moment. Paul was not a man who said things like that easily. The saying of it had cost something. He told his father it was in the past. Paul said yes, but that didn't mean it hadn't happened. They sat in the study together for a while after that, not saying anything further. The documents were still there. The intelligence files were still on the other table. The gap between the present situation and what was coming was still what it was. But House Haxon was not the house it had been. And Damian was not the man, or the weapon, he had been. He had a family that was alive. He had people who knew what he was and had not flinched. He had a sword that was still growing into itself, and a body that was building toward the tier it needed to reach, and an honest accounting of the distance remaining between where he stood and what was coming. He picked up the intelligence files and went back to work. Somewhere in the northern mountains, in a region that had been empty for 2 generations because of something that was not a plague, dark energy was accumulating around a point that Damian had been to once in a previous life and intended to visit again. This time, he was going to be the one who walked away.